Good afternoon. Thank you, all of you, for coming today to our celebration of the 232nd birthday of the United States Constitution. We appreciate all of you coming today. There's food. Please help yourselves. There is a lot. Crowder College, in compliance with federal mandate, observes Constitution Day every year on the 17th of September, or on the weekday nearest to the 17th of September in the event that such should fall on a weekend. This is the date that the framers of the Constitution, after 5 months of wrangling in Constitution Hall in Philadelphia, they didn't call it that yet, that was ex post facto nomenclature, decided that they were going to sign the document that they created. So as a federal financial aid fund receiving institution, we do observe Constitution Day every year, and it is one of our better attended events. Generally, I can only blame shortfalls in our institutional communication for this year's unfortunate shortage, but it makes me that much more appreciative of every one of you who have chosen to come today and participate. So I want to recognize that y'all are spending your lunch breaks here, and I appreciate that. Thank you for coming. So I would also like to thank all of our contributing members of the Crowder community for supporting this event. It really does take a village to put this production on. We are grateful in particular to Great Western Dining, who provided the snacks today. We are very happy to have worked with the Crowder College Public Relations Office to disseminate the word as best we could about this event. The Friends of the Lee Library have provided the pocket constitutions at the entrance. If you did not get one on the way in, you can get one on the way out. Those are for you, courtesy of the Friends of the Library organization. We're grateful to be able to work with them this year as well. We're also grateful to Student Life and Campus Life for their cooperation in securing the facilities, and this would not have happened today without the maintenance and custodial staff here scrambling to turn the room over and make it ready for you after filling the 3 separate conference rooms with FFA teenagers this morning. A lot has happened in this space since 11 o'clock. So those guys are fantastic. And if you would, I would appreciate it if you would join me in thanking all of those people for their contributions. Thank you also especially to Stephen Wolven, who is not only video recording this event, but has also participated rigorously in the setup of the room today. So what we are looking at today is the topic of executive privilege in the Constitution. And while I will leave it to our very talented debaters to introduce their topics and their parameters for themselves, I did want to say a word or two about the subject because it is at once eminently timely and also eminently timeless. Because the executive privilege was one of the sticking points for the constitutional debaters in the moment that this document was released to the United States. Because on the 17th of September, the framers of the Constitution signed this document, but it did not become law. Instead, this document is disseminated to state constitutional committees, and their job is to decide if they think it's appropriate for them to participate in a government framed by the Constitution or not. And there emerge, as tends to happen in the United States when things are controversial, multiple schools of thought. And so we see the emergence of, first of all, a group of people who obviously want the Constitution to pass. If those did not exist, we would not have had the Constitution. And those Federalists argue that the executive branch is essential to keeping Congress in check, to control the legislative branch, and also to provide accountability to the United States. Alexander Hamilton claimed that without an executive branch, there would be no accountability because the executive branch, by virtue of having multiple members, would play a game of finger-pointing instead. Opponents, though, were numerous. There were a lot of people, understandably, who were frightened by this document. And that seems difficult maybe to conceptualize in the 21st century because we accept that the Constitution has done a pretty good job at a pretty hard job for a pretty long time. But when the document was first proposed, keep in mind it was 1787, it was only 11 years before that we had declared our independence in 1776, declaring that a monarchy, the notion of a head guy in charge of government, was something that we were not comfortable with as a country. So when we proposed 11 years later that maybe we should have a head guy, for a lot of people their minds go back to not so far away in their own living memories, and they say, we had a head guy, and that didn't work out. And so there were opponents. And one of the premier opponents actually was Patrick Henry, the famous patriot of the Revolutionary War, who argued actually that a president general had the potential to become a king to all intents and purposes. He was concerned about a head guy. even under the framework of a constitution. And so this is the subject that our debaters are going to examine today, but this is a controversy that is not only timely now. It was a subject that is and always has been a subject of profound debate. So I hope that you will enjoy it, and with that I will turn the floor over to Kristen Stout, who is going to introduce the college debate process and the subject that our very talented debaters are going to take on today. Thank you.
Very hard for short people. All right, so thank you everybody for coming today. I want to do two things before we get this debate started. The first is to give a little bit of additional context and background to what will be happening in this particular debate today. And the second is to talk to you a little bit about what the debate process looks like. So the first thing that I would like to do for introducing the topic is I'm going to start with a quote and then tell you a little bit of the background that our debaters will be discussing, so they don't have to use their valuable speech time to do that themselves, so they can actually make the arguments. So this is from a Christian Science Monitor article, and it says, Thomas Jefferson authorized Louisiana Purchase without constitutional authority. Andrew Jackson boosted presidential power by recruiting his own bureaucracy through the spoils system. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and other constitutional rights during the Civil War. Theodore Roosevelt foreshadowed today's manipulation of the news media by using the White House as a bully pulpit. However, it was in the last 50 years that we've seen the greatest change in executive authority. In part, this is due to our influence in the world and the ever-expanding definition of the role of president. In particular, we'll be discussing two areas of expanded congressional authority. The first of those is war powers and what does and does not define a war. As war has changed, the role of the executive has changed, new weapons have been included, especially things like drones. And the authorization of those drone strikes has altered the way that we think about what is and isn't a weapon of war. As it currently exists, drone strikes are allowed by the authorization of the president alone, and very little other information is required to be provided to Congress. So that's one way in which executive authority in the context of war has expanded dramatically in the less time. The second place, and probably the more controversial of these areas, is in the context of immigration. While the Constitution speaks very limitedly about the role of the executive in immigration, the vast majority of discussions about immigration, including how many immigrants we let in every year, the cap for things like refugees and temporary protected status, all of those things are almost solely currently being done by the executive. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. However, Congress tends to not do all the things, especially if they can blame it on somebody else. So the executive has taken a much expanded role in the context of immigration, which has really been the context for a lot of our discussion around immigration, which the debaters will get to in much more detail. In terms of how this debate happens, this is a modified format of Lincoln-Douglas debate, which is modeled after the original debates by Lincoln and Douglas. Each of these debaters will speak for a roughly 4-minute constructive, and there will be a short cross-examination period after each where they present their argument and the other side gets to ask questions. And then they will each do a rebuttal where they respond to the other side and explain why they're right and their opponent is wrong. So, without further ado, we will start with the affirmative constructive. Yay, debaters.
Testing, okay. After dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Harry S. Truman famously said, "A president cannot always be popular." This is especially true in today's world. Whether they're getting something accomplished or not, a president can't always be popular. But that's something that Congress has strived so hard to be, is that of popular, causing them to neglect many of the problems that do exist in American society. So there have been executive orders to combat those problems through executive action. And that first point is that of war powers themselves and how those have been expanded through that of executive action. Now, those measures do include that first one being that of placing troops in failed or unstable territories or states. Now, that can be domestic or foreign. We saw that as far back as 1871 when President Grant sent many of his military to combat the KKK, which had been newly formed in the area. He sent the soldiers down in the South to save and protect many African American people in the southern states. Now, this is actually a military action and only an executive order that accomplished that act. Now, this is also something that happens overseas as well. It doesn't just happen domestically. When we look towards South Korea, according to a New York Times article on August 25th, 2019, they talked about how South Korea was in desperate need of military help. They were in desperate need because of the threat of North Korea and many other international threats against them. So the U.S. stepped in, and our president sent over many soldiers to defend the area of South Korea. It's not all just attacking people with drone strikes. It's not just all that. It is also defending certain areas. But when looking towards those drone strikes, they are to actually solve a threat or an immediate threat itself. We actually target that of terrorist organizations or people that we knowingly know that are terrorists themselves. That actually takes in that second point, being that of the president oversight of immigration is absolutely necessary. The president's power within immigration began when Congress delegated much of the current power to the executive office due to their mission of keeping personal reputation as bolstered as possible. So because they delegated that power and essentially gave it to that of the executive office, being that of the president, we saw that the executive office took much of that power and has now been using it to solve many of the current issues and issues that we have faced before. Now, in 2012, Obama faced a crisis, and that is that of immigration. Now, he actually did an executive order being that of DACA because Congress could not pass legislation protecting the dreamers that were inside of the United States. So he passed the executive order in 2012 to defend the dreamers, and now, 7 years later, Congress has finally acted and passed the Dreamer Act. 7 years later, after the 2012 executive order. This shows how an executive order can face the immediacy of a threat while Congress finally decides to make legislative action. And that's something that's great about an executive order and executive power, that while Congress is dilly-dallying in their own time, we can have something solve for the problem in the meantime. So the president has many powers that have been gifted through Article 2 of the Constitution. And one of those was that of war powers with drone strikes and using the military and sending them into certain areas. And that second point was that of the presidential oversight of immigration has actually been very efficient, that we should actually support the executive actions themselves.
All right, so a lot of the points that you make really just point specifically to the expediency of the president in order to do this, correct?
Absolutely. As in times where nothing is getting done, it is efficient and it is necessary that we finally solve something for when the problem is being postponed by Congress.
But isn't it true that most of these executive actions tend to be overturned within 2 more presidential administrations?
Yes, but that has actually allowed time for many legislative actions to take place, which is what the executive order is trying to allow for.
So if we look specifically at something such as the KKK Act that was passed by Grant, isn't it true that within the next presidential election that was actually overturned and gutted and actually ended Reconstruction?
Yes, but that was because not only was modern America at that time notably racist, but it was also because of the simple fact that our Congress was not taking action. An executive order is not permanent. It is something that is trying to allow time for action to be taken.
Okay, but is it more important to allow for an immediate effect to take place or to allow for a permanent effect to remain in place?
You can do both. You can have something solve for the problem at hand immediately while Congress does write up bills or draft something that can solve the problem when they enact it later.
Okay, and then whenever we look at something like DACA, isn't it true that now really the only thing in place is the legislative act instead?
Yes, because that's the point of an executive order.
Okay, and then whenever we look at things such as these drone strikes that have been occurring, Do we really know the exact amount of the drone strikes that have been sent out into these foreign nations?
We don't, because President Trump, as of now, has not given out those numbers.
Okay, and do you know how we actually determine what is defined as a militant person in these drone strikes?
A person of age 16 to 60.
Okay, so is it really, are these actual accounts of as many terrorists have been, that have been taken out actually really as accurate as we would like them?
While those might not be as accurate as we would like them to be, it is still a necessary threat to stop any idea or threat of terror, as that is something that is immediate to our overall national security.
Okay. As Lao Tzu, a famous Chinese philosopher, once said, "Whenever virtue is lost, benevolence appears. And whenever benevolence is lost, right conduct appears. And whenever right conduct is lost, expedience appears. Expediency is the mere shadow of right and truth. It's the beginning of disorder." What we need to see is that as of right now, a lot of these presidential actions that have been put in place and all of these executive actions have actually shown the failings of the executive branch and the amount of overreach that it has and the failings of what's happening, as we'll be getting into. First off, in terms of war powers. Now, within recent years, specifically the Bush administration, presidential war powers have been expanded very dramatically, specifically in things such as drone strikes. In fact, a lot of the actual talkings about for drone strikes is specifically predicated on the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which were awful and terrible and predicated a major shift in terms of our actions in foreign powers, specifically in the Middle East. But one key thing to remember is that actually, throughout the entirety of the rest of the Bush administration, from 2001, whenever the 9/11 attacks happened, all the way to 2008, whenever Obama came in, Bush had one drone strike ever happen, which took out 6 terrorists, and that was the final action that ever happened. It actually only started picking up speed whenever Obama stepped in. During the entirety of his presidency, he launched about 130. And according to Nicholas Grossman, a professor of international relations, on April 2nd of this year, what ended up happening is specifically that actually a very large amount of people killed were civilians. But also the number of people killed is incredibly difficult to pinpoint because of how we determine who is a militant and not just a civilian. Because how they determine a militant is specifically just that it is a male of military age, meaning that any male from ages 14 to 60 within these areas is considered militant. And what ends up happening is that there could very easily be incredibly innocent people who have their lives taken away because they are suspected terrorists, which is one of the main points, is that actually a lot of this is extrajudicial. There's no trial, there's no jury, there's nothing. What ends up happening is that the president takes lives into his own hands, and it's not even just suspected terrorists that are taken out, or just civilians in these other areas. There are also targeted strikes specifically on US citizens, and that is also an incredibly big point that's been completely skipped over. And what we need to look towards in this is that there should not be targeted strikes on US citizens or these failings in terms of actual reporting of numbers in any sort of way on these, especially because there's no right to the trial or right of jury in any way, shape, or form. Now, also what we need to see is that in places such as sending troops in unstable states, like in, as he noted specifically, South Korea, what we need to see is that the point is not that they got sent there, it's that they've remained there even though they're no longer wanted. South Korea is no longer unstable. They don't have all these threats around anymore. They've actually stabilized, but people are still going. But the America has stayed as of right now and is continuing to remain way past their breaking point. Now, moving on to things such as immigration, what we need to see is specifically that the main failing of all of these executive actions for any type of immigration is that the next administration almost always completely flops what was wanted and what was done during the last one. What we can see is that Bush wasn't very good with allowing immigration, and then Obama stepped in and he opened the floodgates a lot with a lot of his actions, and then Trump stepped in and he completely turned it again. As of right now, we let in very few immigrants. We don't have many refugees. The suspended protections of many of these have been removed. And the next administration may very well likely flip it again and allow in even more immigrants. The main point that I'm trying to make here is that a lot of times these presidential acts don't have the long-lasting effects that we actually look for, and that they come in and then within 4 to 8 years they're completely gone. And the only way that these actually remain and last is if they are passed by the legislative branch, which doesn't always happen. So it's for the reasons that these acts almost always tend to be overturned, and also that all of this happens extrajudicially most of the time, that it's not actually something that we should be allowing.
If DACA were not in place, how many people would be deported?
Well, what we need to see is that specifically, what the issue with this is that with DACA put in place, the actual instability of it made it so that for an incredibly long while right after Trump was elected, there was a big fear in every single dreamer that they may or may not be deported. There was no knowledge of whether or not this was going to remain or not until Congress was able to pass the Dreamers Act and was able to actually solidify that they would be able to remain.
Okay, so between 2012, if Obama had not passed that executive order, and 2019 to when the bill was actually passed, what would have happened to all those people who had never known a single other form of life besides American life?
We aren't actually sure, but the key point here is not necessarily that it didn't help, because it did have some helpful effects. The point is that it was not permanent, and that it actually required the legislative branch to step in and fix things in order to solidify that they would be able to remain.
Isn't that the point of an executive order, to solve a problem before legislative action can take place?
But as I brought up, the main point is that really it's not just the immediacy of the effect and the immediacy of helping, because a lot of times these dreamers were here long before the 2012 issue came up. They were here long before that, and they still hadn't been deported. There was a very real chance that they weren't going to be deported without this executive action in place. This was something that was added in order to help ascertain that they would be able to remain, but then increased fears again as 2017 rolled around.
If the DACA Act was not put in place in 2012, wouldn't they live in constant fear of being deported in that 7-year time span?
That might have been possible, but also during that time, Congress could have passed legislation such as the Dreamer Act, which they then passed 7 years later once they realized that the DACA executive order actually got repealed.
Isn't that a main point, is that it was passed 7 years later, not in 2012, not when the issue was prevalent?
Well, it was passed 7 years later because for 7 years there was an executive order in place, so they believed that they were fine and didn't have to do their jobs.
Okay, no further questions. Harry S. Truman was once famously quoted in saying, "The buck stops here." Now that is something that Congress has actually not been doing. They have not been allowing the buck to stop at them, and they've actually been delegating much of their power to that of the executive office. That's why the presidency has so much power as he does now, is because much of that power was delegated to him by the legislative branch. So that's why the executive power has grown so much, or grown so exponentially. Now, looking at my opponent's first point, being that of drone strikes themselves. Now, when we look at the effectiveness of drone strikes, we must first realize that not only is this promoting that national security that is key to American life itself, but it's also ending terrorist life. And it's ending those threats that are very prevalent in Middle Eastern countries and many other foreign nations. Because there is a lot of anti-sentiment when it comes to U.S. life, and that is very prevalent in those other nations. So these drone strikes are actually allowing us to stop those threats from ever reaching national security levels, or the breach of national security levels. Now, that second point that he brought up was that of immigration. And again, although executive orders are temporary, they're temporary for a reason. They're supposed to be in place to allow legislative action to take place. They're supposed to give time for Congress to solve many of the issues that they are dealing with in the actual House and in the Senate. That's the point of them. They're not supposed to be something permanent. They're not supposed to stand for 100 years. They're supposed to solve the problem then and allow legislative action to take place afterwards. When going to my own case itself, again, when we look at the war powers that are in the executive office, it's not just drone strikes. It's also allowing the military to be placed in certain areas where they are unstable. And even if South Korea is completely stable now, they don't have the numbers to combat a threat like North Korea, who is militarizing every single one of their people besides their women. They don't have the numbers. They're a much smaller nation in terms of population, and that is such a problem when you don't have the ability to militarily fight another country. Furthermore, we don't just place them in South Korea or in our own nation. There are many Middle Eastern nations that are failed states that we put troops in to make sure that no civilian lives are lost. My opponent likes to focus on the drone strikes that kill a few people every year, or kill an unknown amount of people every year. but he fails to look at the fact that we are saving thousands of lives by putting our soldiers at risk and putting them in these failed states and these unstable areas, these areas riddled with poverty and instability. They don't have the means to defend themselves, and that's why we put our soldiers in these areas. We allow those people to be defended by our soldiers and furthermore protect them from any terrorist acts or terrorist organizations and further harms. And that second point is that of presidential oversight of immigration is absolutely necessary, because although the actual DACA was repealed itself, we actually allowed legislative action, or at least allowed the time frame of legislative action to take place, because there was a problem in 2012 with many Dreamers that would be living in fear if they did not have the DACA Act itself. So when we look towards that itself, again, an executive order isn't supposed to be something that is permanent. It's not supposed to be a living document or something that we are saying is a law. That's not what an executive order is. An executive order and these powers are supposed to solve a problem before Congress can get to it and completely draft a 100-page bill on that topic. It is something that is a little broader and solves the problem immediately and allows Congress to take a more in-depth look at it later. So that's why we should realize that the executive powers are actually a good thing in American society. Flex on me.
Ah, dang it. You warned me, but it just didn't happen. All right. As Lord Acton, a British historian, once noted, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. Now, my opponent talks about how all this power has been passed from Congress to the executive branch. But what we need to look towards here is that this power has corrupted the presidential branch and has turned it into doing a ton of terrible actions in order to attempt to pass whatever they feel is necessary, but what may not actually be necessary. And we can see this when we look first towards that of the war powers. Now, as I've mentioned multiple times, these drone strikes are not just actually taking out confirmed terrorists. These are drone strikes against suspected terrorists. There's been no major investigation. We aren't certain about how many drone strikes happened. We don't know how many people are killed, but also there's no jury, there's no trial, and they are sent out and they are killed. But also U.S. citizens are also being targeted by these drone strikes. Not in as large of numbers or anything of that nature, but there are U.S. citizens that have been killed by targeted drone strikes against them because they're suspected of being terrorists. But even though they're an American citizen, they don't get a trial, they don't get any sort of jury, they get executed without any actual knowledge of it by us as American citizens. And that's the key point. The main reason why the legislative branch has to actually pass bills and has to look for a while before we declare war or commit these wartime actions is because they look at what their constituents want, what we want, what we feel is right, and what we feel is good. And then they go and put that action into place. The president doesn't have to do that. The president doesn't have to tell us that he's even doing drone strikes, as we've seen this past year. The president doesn't have to tell us whenever he does this. He does it on his own time and whenever he feels like it. And that's what causes almost all of the issues that are passed here. Now, we can also see this when we look towards all the troops that have been put into failed states or into unstable areas like South Korea and Japan after World War II. And what we can see there is that specifically South Korea actually wants us out because with us there, they're unable to militarize. We've actively stopped them from being able to militarize and create their own weapons and have their own standing army and put our own army there in place. As of right now, we could leave and let them create their own military and have their own weapons. It's that we've actively stopped them from doing that. And it's the same story in Japan, and that we've taken away all their entire ability to militarize, and that's why we're there in the first place. That's what happens in all of these failed states as well. We step in and we stop them from being able to do anything, and we take away their autonomy and their ability to do anything based just on one person's orders. And that's what creates all these dangers. We can really see this whenever we look at things such as the immigration, onto the second point. And what we can see is that a lot of times these so-called solutions aren't necessary solutions to the problem. But also, a lot of it isn't even necessarily just things such as DACA. Many other things that the president's able to control are how many refugees are allowed into the nation every year, how many immigrants are allowed every year, where those immigrants are allowed from, whether or not we have temporary protected status on certain citizens of certain nations. And what we can see is that this is all done under the president's privilege. He decides whether or not we extend temporary protected status to multiple nations. He decides whether or not we even allow a certain amount of immigrants into the nation every single year. He decides whether or not we allow refugees and how many refugees. And that's the biggest issue, because there is no voting on this. There's no actual process through it. It is whatever he decides and whatever he passes through. And then maybe he gets checked by some other branches, but typically he doesn't. And that's what causes almost all of these issues, and that he's not being checked, and he's overreaching far past what he was originally allowed by the Constitution, because he's been given powers beyond whatever it allowed him because Congress is unwilling to do their job. And that's one of the biggest issues that currently rises, and which is why presidential overreach is such a major issue as of right now.
Thank you, Colby. Thank you, Mason. These gentlemen put a lot of work into today's presentation and a great deal of research into preparing their arguments, and get to share a classroom with each other. What an elegant demonstration of the ability to disagree politically without name-calling or other unsavory conduct. What an elegant way to elevate our conversations through intellect and evidence. So congratulations, gentlemen. Please join me in giving them a hand again.